Hi everyone, Stepan here. It's Thursday, so welcome to another Thursday Endgame video. Today I would like to talk about a very important endgame principle that many weaker players like me don't think about consciously during the game and don't deploy during the game. And that's the principle of two weaknesses. Now it states that normally one weakness is not enough to win the game. If we imagined any random endgame with either one or two minor pieces or a rook endgame, if the defender has only one weakness or if the weaker side only has one weakness, then usually using his king and his remaining piece, he will be able to defend the weakness successfully sometimes. Of course, there are cases where one weakness is overwhelming, but those are much rarer. So the principle of two weaknesses states that you need two weaknesses to win the game. If there are more, great. If there are two weaknesses, then usually that's going to be too much for the defender to handle, and either he's going to have to let one of them go, meaning he loses material, or he will lose in another way. Now, an important thing to know is that weaknesses are not just the most obvious points in your position, in your opponent's position. In this first example, game between Ulf Andersson and Robert Hübner, obviously it's the c6 backward pawn, it's the f6 backward pawn, and here they're apparent. But your opponent's weakness can also be one of your advantages. For example, you have a passed pawn, that's your opponent's weakness and your advantage at the same time. So, for example, if in this position white had a passed pawn on d5 and black had a backwards pawn on f6, black would still have two weaknesses because he has a passed pawn he has to play against, and he also has a backwards pawn on f6. That's not easy to defend. So if you want to pause the video and create a plan for white, once you recognize the weaknesses in a position, in your opponent's position, it's important to stop, think, formulate a plan, and then play according to that plan. Okay, so in this position, if it was black to play, he could play the move c5, get rid of his weakness and try to get his king into the position. A rook trade would most probably lead to a draw if the c6 pawn is dissolved. So black has to try to play that, and it's white's move, so white plays rook to c5. Well, that's the first part of the plan. Now, if you know that these are weaknesses, of course h6 is weak as well, and long term that's very important, but these are the two crucial weaknesses you have to play against. How do we get to them? Obviously the position is closed, so our rook alone cannot do much. Moving our rook would allow c5, the pawn break that would liberate black's position and rid him of his biggest weakness. So we have to do something with our king. So how do we come up with a plan that involves the king into the game? Well, the most obvious move, or the most obvious plan, is to force black to trade one of his weaknesses for a different type of weakness. And you can achieve that by playing the move e4. Now, once you play e4, if black ever takes, then you are going to have a potential passed pawn in the center, and that pawn is eventually going to move forward. On the other hand, after e4, if white is allowed to take on d5, then the d5 pawn will need handling, and it's not going to be easy to defend. The rook will basically have to get behind the pawn and stay behind the pawn because the king is cut off, cannot approach the pawn. So black will be playing on these three squares, defending the pawn. During that time, white could either try to get his king into the position, which is probably the best idea, or he could try to do something active with his rook in the meantime. For example, attack the second weakness and the third weakness, f6 and h6. So black here plays rook e8. It's not like he can do much. Of course, it stops e4 for the moment. King to d3, now reinforcing e4. Rook to e7. Again, black is playing passively. White is the one who has to win this position. Black is waiting to lose, but if white plays aimlessly and without a plan, he's not going to do much. So here he plays e4. And now what can black do? Taking the pawn would make the f6 pawn basically indefensible. If you allow this rook to get even more scope and to be able to target both the c6 weakness and the f6 weakness, then black would have a much harder time defending than after what happened in the game, which was still very, very bad. So let's look at d takes e4. So after d takes e4, f takes e4. And now this pawn is hard to defend. So black, for example, plays rook to e6, defending both of his weaknesses. We now continue with rook to f5. Now this rook only has one square it could go to, so rook to d6. And now we simply wait. We simply play good moves that improve our position slowly. We wait with the attack. We don't have to rush. We can optimize everything before we try to win one of the weaknesses. Now they still exist, of course. c5 is prevented. f6 is weak. The black king can move, but not too far away. So there is not much black can do. So in the meantime, white can make his position better. So white would play the move b3, for example. Let's say king c7, a3, stopping any advances black could go for on the queen side. King to b6, again, black has no easy ideas. And on b4, locking the position. Now once this structure is fixed, now you can consider attacking ideas. One very simple plan is I'm going to play king e3, and then I'm going to play the move e5 eventually, and then I'm going to have a passed pawn, and then you're going to have two weaknesses on h6 and on c6, and eventually either my pawn is going to queen or you are going to lose one of your pawns. So after e4, taking on e4 is really a bad idea. In this position, Robert Hübner played rook to d7, which, I mean, defends d5. So if you don't take on e4, you have to defend your d5 pawn. And this is what we were talking about. Now the rook is doomed, and it has to stay on the d file on these three squares. On the other hand, white's rook, after an exchange of pawns, would be free to move. Now, there is a variation which I'd analyzed, which is a simple win for white, but you would probably have to invest a lot of time to see that the endgame in which both sides queen is winning. So I can understand why white didn't go for that. I would never go for that during the game because it's so easy to mess up calculation when calculating a queen endgame, especially 10 or so moves down. That's practically impossible in my opinion. It's impossible to see whether your opponent has a check that goes into a perpetual. So the winning idea, which works, would have been ed, and now if pawn d, then yeah, that's just a weakness that black is never going to be able to defend. You can just do this and advance, get your king to f5, get your king to g6, and win one of the pawns. So this would just be horrible. I mean, yeah, there's no way to stop white. You can check, fine, but then you have to go back, and then I get here, then I push the pawn, and then, yeah. Okay, so rook d5 was my analysis as the best move. And now we continue king e4, which is a pawn sacrifice, but it works. So in this position, black really should move the rook away and allow your king into the position, which loses in a different way. So for example, rook d7, king f5, white would win, even though this pawn would be lost. But let's say takes, king takes, and king f5. And now white is quicker. This is the position I was talking about. It's very, very hard to calculate all of this. But black tries to queen, white tries to queen. By the way, you could have also taken the pawn on g5. Not a big difference. And this endgame is winning for white because he has a 2-1. And the main thing is king safety in queen endgames, and white's king could be shielded by these two pawns. But understandable, of course. E takes d5 was a strange move to make if you're a human. So he plays a3, stopping counterplay, rook d8 played. You have to keep defending your pawn. And now there was a much quicker winning idea, basically fixing the queen side with b4, and after AB, let's say rook to d7 defending. Now you continue with king e3, and after rook d6 or rook d8, now you take on d5. And after rook takes d5, now you continue with e4, and there is no more defense. The king is getting to f5, or you lose the pawn. And if after e takes d5 he takes with the pawn, then simply rook c8, and yeah, there will be no easy defense to this. And of course it's important that white's pawn is much quicker when it comes to queening. But after rook d8, Ulf Andersson didn't play that. He waited a bit more, and now there were probably 5 or so useless moves played, maybe even more. So yeah, both sides just waiting. Okay, rook d7, rook c5, and white was doing nothing. Probably it was hard to calculate everything. And after rook d8, he finally does play b4. Now, allowing white to take would lose the c6 pawn. Moving the rook to defend the c6 pawn or the a pawn would allow e d5, cd5, rook d5. Pushing the pawn forward to a4 would just give white a freer hand. At least this way black opens the a file and could hope for some chances, although very slim chances, because if you try rook a8 then e d5, and if rook check then king e4, defends f3, and there are no targets. So rook d7, black still waits, and now finally e d5, rook d5, and king to e4, and this is the position we already saw just with the a pawns traded off. And now this is, yeah, these 3 weaknesses are too much for black to handle. He plays rook d8. Now king f5 unnecessarily loses the d4 pawn, so I think maybe that was too rash from me last time in my analysis, so just d5. And yeah, okay, if rook e8, then king f5 without losing the pawn, cd5, rook d5, rook e3 seems scary, but king f6, rook f3 check, king to g7, and after rook f4 you simply continue rook d6 and pick up the pawns, and yeah, this pawn is going to queen regardless of whether black wins the g pawn and the b pawn. So coming back to the original position, which was the most important, this endgame is complex and knowing what to do is important. So formulating a plan is key to exploiting the 2 weaknesses in this endgame. Now again, if black didn't have the weakness on f6 or the weakness on c6, this game would have hardly been winning. I may be wrong, but it would have been much harder to come up with a human plan. But once you know what to do, all the moves come naturally. Rook c5 is the only move here. a3 b4 is a good idea to fix the queen side, and then finally king d3 e4 and getting your king to f5 and into the position is just an unstoppable plan. Okay, moving on to the next game, we're going to have a look at a very old game played between Walter von Holzhausen and Aaron Nimzowitsch in Hanover in 1926, and I chose this position because black is already better, black is a pawn up, but you have to play actively if you want to win. So what black doesn't want to allow is white to control the 7th rank, so any rook f7 would either force a rook trade or a double rook trade, after which the e4 pawn would be hard to defend, or black would simply pick up the g and the h pawns. So for the moment the d6 knight is defending, but still white has no weaknesses with this many pieces on the board, and white has no weaknesses unless you induce them. So Nimzowitsch came up with a very aggressive plan, which I like a lot, but I don't think I would ever consider it in a real game. He played the move a5, and now what white wants to do is play the move a4. And after a4, there will be a weakness, because black will have the a file to play for with his rooks. That's the main idea. And if the pawn is ever taken, then white would have pawns on a2 and a4, which would be the 2 weaknesses. Now in this position, what are the 2 weaknesses for white? I would say the e4 pawn is a weakness for white because it has to be blockaded, it has to be controlled. And now after a5, the threat of black controlling the a file is a weakness, and there is no easy way to stop that. If cb5 is played, the knight b5 check forces the king away into a very awkward position and gets the knight to d4. So after king b2, knight d4, rook ef2, let's say rook e7, just defending. The white king is now very inactive. This pawn is now much quicker in advancing, and after the knight blockade is lifted, it could advance. So this wouldn't be such a good idea, because white would have made his king much worse. So after a5 he plays rook e to f2, which I can understand. Now there were 2 ideas. a4, Nimzowitsch played a4, which is great, very human move. Also b4 was a very good move, probably even more precise, because now after king to b2, You can continue with rook e7, just guarding the 7th rank, making sure there are no weaknesses in the position. And after something like rook f8, wanting to trade rooks, you can take. White takes, and now we play rook a7, and of course the b3 pawn is going to be a permanent weakness. And again, black would have two weaknesses to exploit, one of them the weak b3 pawn, and the second one his passed pawn. And of course, most importantly, no counterplay for white. The 7th rank is defended. The white knight has the d5 square, and that's fine, but it doesn't amount to that much. So in this position, for example, knight d5, a4, it's hard to find a move for white. White doesn't want to take, of course. White shouldn't move his king away, because if he moves the king away, the rook will be allowed into a2. So I don't know, let's say king c1. It's just a weird move. So takes, rook a3, king b2, and now this is a weakness, this is a weakness, and of course this is a weakness. And there may even be ideas of something like knight takes c4, and basically a perfectly easy position to win for black. Instead of that, Nimzowitsch created weaknesses in a different way. He played the move a4. Now, of course, if you allow black to take, then b3 is again a weakness after b4 check, so he plays ba4, which is understandable. And of course you don't take on a4, because then you would be the side with the weaknesses. But bc4, and now these two pawns are very hard, if not impossible, to defend. White doesn't want to lose a pawn, so he played rook to f8, offering a rook trade, and after rook to e7 takes, he took on c4, and after knight c4, king c4, black played rook to a8, which is seemingly risky because it allows rook f7, but the a4 pawn is falling with check. And now you can see that these two and this weakness, basically you can call the two weaknesses now the h3 pawn and the a file pawns. Now after rook f7, rook takes a4, king to b3, rook b4 check, king to c3, and now rook to b7, defending the 7th rank. No activity for white, basically a lost endgame. Passed pawn, two weak pawns for white, and Nimzowitsch converted easily. Rook f5 played, rook a7 attacking the pawn, king c4, again trading weaknesses, but yeah. Rook a4 played very precise, king b3 defending, and now rook d4, and now the king is cut off from the passed pawn, and the conversion really is quite simple. King d6, chasing the rook away, no 7th rank activity, rook e8, rook d3 check, advancing forward, rook takes h3, and now we really don't have to look at this anymore. The interesting thing is that in this position, Nimzowitsch came up with a plan to induce weaknesses, which was very powerful and basically unstoppable. Now, when it comes to inducing weaknesses, you of course have to be aware of counterplay. So whenever white got the chance to occupy the 7th rank, black countered that. If you allow counterplay, that the weaknesses are not as important because you have to focus on defense. But you also have to be brave enough to know that apparent weaknesses in your position, for example, the d5 square or the 7th rank, are either defensible or irrelevant. So the move knight d5 was never really a threat. Okay, moving on to the third position, which is very complicated. We have this position. Karpov is playing white against Bruno Parma, and we have some weaknesses to look at. The first and the only weakness for the moment is the d6 pawn. Now this example I chose because white declined playing a position in which black would be left with only one weakness. Now this is a good example of how one weakness cannot be easily exploited. Of course, d6 can be fixed, or you can try to fix it, and it can be attacked, but it's quite easy for black to defend it 3 times. And if you just pile up on d6, then it's status quo and nothing is changing in the position. So for example, if you play the move queen to d3, attacking d6 and trying to play the move e4, fixing the weakness, which seems like a very obvious human plan, now black could play the move b5, and your rook is of course pinned. Queen would take the rook if cb5, so yeah, and your pawn is attacked, you don't have a way to defend, so you'll be forced to play c5, and after dc5, Rook c takes c5. It might seem like there is a lot of activity for white in this position, and that may be true, but it's most probably not going to be enough to win, because all of a sudden a3 is a weakness, the king is a weakness. Imagine a move like e4 and rook c1 check. So this would have given black a ton of counterplay. So the most intuitive way to fight against the one weakness black has doesn't really work, and it's very hard to do anything if you do that. So Karpov played a move which I'm still not sure I understand completely, but I'm going to try to explain it. He played the move f4. Now the idea behind f4 is he wants to create a second weakness, and he highlights the f7 pawn as the main problem in black's position. Now all of a sudden d6 is not the main issue, f7 is the main issue, and those two weaknesses combined will create a ton of pressure on black's position. It will affect the king's safety, and it will also affect the piece activity. So let's look at the options. Of course, just a second. Rook e8 was played in the game, which allows f takes e5. Let us just look at the main alternative. So after f4, what happens on e takes f4? Which I think is the critical move. Now, after e takes f4, queen takes f4, these two weaknesses are very obvious, and d6 will have to be defended for the rest of the game, f7 will have to be defended for the rest of the game. And one thing which I would like to note, and which is very important here, is that a move like, f7, a move like f7, f6, advancing the pawn, would terminally weaken the 7th rank, in which case black would have king safety issues beyond repair, and all of a sudden pawn weaknesses would be almost irrelevant. So for example, and black is not lost, this position is almost equal, but for humans, black has two weaknesses which are easy to target, white has weaknesses which are already targeted, but they're not as important. King safety is more important, and also they're not easy to get to, and they can be dissolved. So for example, rook d7 defending f7 would be a mistake, because in this position queen d4 would give a deadly check, and after king to g8 you could play c5. Of course the pawn is pinned to the rook, and d takes c5 would lose material. So for example, b takes c5, b takes c5 would allow white to create a very strong passed pawn and still have a lot of pressure on d6. So after queen takes f4, black would have to play something like king g8 to make sure he doesn't allow this check. And now, for example, rook c3 or queen d4, and let's say rook c3, queen c6, queen d4, trying to play the move c5, queen c7, you wait, your rook is defended, and it's unclear how white proceeds, and it's not easy to win this position, but he's still playing for two weaknesses. So for a human, it would be much easier to play this position for white. Now, before we continue, let's go back to the original position and look at the idea after the move queen d3, trying to fix the d6 pawn. The resulting position is a position in which black has a ton of counterplay. If you look at the position after ef4 and this position at queen c7, black doesn't have that much counterplay. Fine, white has weaknesses, but black's weaknesses are far more important, and if one of them falls, then either the king side falls and the king is unsafe, or the remaining queen side pawns are going to fall. Okay, in the game after f4, black didn't take. He played what I think is a better move. He played rook e8. And now, there were a couple of options. Karpov could have played queen d3, attacking d6. After this, and rook e6, f takes e5 is, I think, the best option. And after d takes e5, getting rid of one of your weaknesses. Now playing rook d7 seems very scary. And for example, queen c6, rook f1, and a ton of pressure on f7. e5 is weak. And for example, rook f6, queen f6 would give white a lot of activity in this position. So after the move rook e8, probably queen d3 was the best option, simply increasing the pressure on black's position and forcing him to defend two squares, d6 and f7. Also, f5 was a possibility, and after f5 I'm not sure how white should proceed, because black, of course, that doesn't have to take. He can continue with, for example, rook e to d8, defending d6, let's say king h2, making your king better. Probably f6 would even work, because now e5 is defended, d6 is defended, and this is, I think, the most instructive point, that now black has the one weakness on d6, and there is no way for white to make progress. And that's why f5 would probably be a bad idea. In the game, Karpov didn't play queen d3, he didn't play f5, he played e takes f. I'm sorry, f takes e. And with this move, in addition to the weakness on e5, which is about to happen once d5 is played, there are a few more advantages. Firstly, the f7 pawn is weak. Secondly, white has play on the rook on the d file with his rooks, and the rook activity is a huge weakness for black, or a huge advantage for white. After f takes e5, it's very hard to play black, even though the engines would say that the position is almost equal. Now, rook takes e5 shouldn't be discarded, but I don't believe it's such a good move, because white can play the move queen d4, pinning the rook, and now, yeah, for a human, I don't believe this. For example, if rook d8 is played, then c5, your rook is pinned again. This rook is pinned, this pawn is basically immobile. So let's say b takes c5, b takes c5, f6 to try and defend, and now c6, and this passed pawn will be an overwhelming weakness for black, after which this weakness and this weakness will decide the game. So after f5, d5 played, of course getting rid of your d6 weakness, but now Karpov has changed his advantages, or traded black's weaknesses for different types of weaknesses. Now e5 is a weakness, f7 is a weakness, and if you try to get rid of both of them by playing f6, then your 7th rank is a weakness, which is overwhelming, including the queenside problems with the a and b pawns, which are probably going to be enough for white to win the game. So f6 is not a move you want to play. And now Karpov continues very sensibly c5. Of course, white is not threatening to take, because the rook is attacked and hanging with check. So black continues rook e6, stopping the move c6. For the moment, queen d3, getting activity on the d file, highlighting the f7 weakness, because if rook d7 happens, then rook f1 can happen, and yeah, a lot of problems. bc5 was played, which was a huge blunder, and now Karpov could have won the game, not instantly, but fairly quickly with rook d7. This had to be prevented. Now if you try, for example, queen c6, then rook takes c5 is very good, and I mean, I don't see an easy defense for I don't see an easy way to defend the c8 rook. And after rook d7, if you try something like queen to b6, trying to get away from the pawn on c5, then there is a tactic in the position rook takes f7, and after king takes f7, queen to d7 check, and king to f6. Now, much more precise, instead of taking the rook straight away, is to play the move h4, threatening mate. So now e4 has to be played. Now you take the rook, and yeah, it's very hard to play this position. Black is basically lost because of his king safety, because of white's piece activity, and because there are still weaknesses which white could target. But instead, after bc5, Karpov doesn't continue with rook d7, he plays bc5, which is not bad. White is still better, and he has a passed pawn, and there are still the two weaknesses in the position for black. But rook d7 was better. Of course, here you could say that black has three weaknesses: white's passed pawn, the e5 pawn, and the f7 pawn. Queen c6 played, blockading the c5 pawn, rook b1. And now you should note again that f6 is a move you don't want to play for black. If you play f6, then eventually something is going to come to the 7th rank and you're going to be busted. But on the other hand, it's very hard to make moves. Everything is weak. a6 is weak, e5 is weak, f7 is weak, the 7th rank is weak, and your king doesn't look that happy. So let's go through the following moves fairly quickly. Rook f1, Karpov targets f7, rook f8, king h1. It's not clear how you should win, so he makes sort of waiting moves, fixing his rook on d5, rook b8, declining a rook trade, of course, with rook f1. Once one of the weaknesses is a king pawn and king safety is an issue, the side that's attacking doesn't want to trade material. Although he could have gone for rook b8, and after queen b8, rook d6, this would have been Probably a very good idea. There is no easy way to decline a rook trade because the pawn is going to advance, so takes would have given white 2 weaknesses to target, a safer king and the passed pawn, and probably would have been winning enough, but there are tricks with perpetual checks. So I can understand rook f1. Rook b7 played, defending the 7th rank, queen c3, targeting e5 and preparing to push the c pawn if allowed, rook b5, a4 expanding, rook to c1. A lot of waiting moves. Rook c8 stopping the pawn from moving or trying to stop it from moving, but basically waiting moves. Karpov switches his rooks around, targets everything, a5, fixing the a6 weakness. Now there are 4 weaknesses. The king, e5, f7 and a6, rook e to c6 played, and now rook c1. And in this position, of course, rook c1 was played because if you take the e5 pawn, that there could be some issues with the c5 pawn. In fact, I believe that black would take it straight away. So if rook e5, then rook c5, and there is triple pressure on the pawn. And by trading off these 2 pawns, black would probably be okay. So rook c1, and now the e5 pawn is targeted, and probably best was simply rook e6, holding the position together and saying, fine, I have weaknesses, but they're not easy to get to. And probably something like rook b1 would be played, rook b6 would be played, and white is much better, but it's not easily winning. Let's say rook c6, and rook e5, you win a pawn. But after something like queen f6, it's not over yet. White's pawns are weak, and white could be in trouble if he allows a single check or if he loses a single pawn. Still probably easily winning for Karpov, but not as in the game. In the game, Parma played the move f6, and now no weakness on f7, no weakness on e5, but your 7th rank and your king are in trouble. Queen d2. Of course, doubling up on the d file, maybe trying to enter h6, king f7, king h2, making his king safer, no back rank checks, king e8, rook d6. A trade is very welcome, so rook d7, rook d1, tripling up, rook takes, c takes, passed pawn, thank you very much. And from here on, Karpov really didn't have a hard time converting his advantage. Of course, if you look at the weaknesses now, black has 3 weaknesses: the a6 pawn, the d6 passed pawn for white, and the king safety issues. 4 weaknesses probably because the rook is immobile, so black is almost playing a rook down. Queen d3 played, targeting a6. Now, how do you defend a6? What do you do? This is a very simple winning idea. If you play rook a7, then probably just queen d5 would be good. I think offering a queen trade. Queen a2 played, but that does nothing. Queen takes a6. Queen c2 played, attacking the rook. And now a nice tactical check which defends everything. Queen a8, king f7, queen d5, king g7. And we don't have to go any further with this position. I just thought that what Karpov did was so instructive that I really wanted to cover this game. f4 is extremely counterintuitive. It weakens e3. It allows black to get rid of the weakness on d6, but he still played f4 and f takes e5. I thought that was incredible. Okay, the last game we are going to look at briefly is the game Salov-Yusupov from Linares 1990. This one I chose because the weaknesses are fairly obvious and it's clear what white wants to do. So black has a weakness on d4, black has a weakness on f7, and also black's king is weaker. Also, probably the bishop is better than the knight, but I wouldn't call that a weakness. In this position, white plays a great move, rook e7, forcing a queen trade. Forcing a queen trade in this position is smart because it's going to be much easier to target the 2 weaknesses. Despite having traded the queens off, white is going to have an easier time targeting these. Of course, not with the bishop. It may seem strange to trade queens when you have a light squared bishop and a weakness is on a dark square, but by trading queens, he allows his king into the position, and that's why I thought this game was very instructive. He knew that his king is going to be more active, while the black king is going to have to help the f7 pawn. And One very important point about this position and why the queen trade is so powerful is if you try to defend the f-pawn by moving it to f6 or f5, then g6 is impossible to defend because you can never play g5 without allowing white to create a very strong passed pawn and without h5 ultimately being weak because it's on a light square. So this plan has a lot to do with where black's king side pawns are. And of course, because they're on a light square and because they cannot be moved because of the h4 pawn, the queen trade is the best possible solution. Of course, if you decline a queen trade, how can you decline a queen trade? Well, if you play queen c8, then queen e5 check wins the rook. If you play queen g4, queen e5 check wins the rook. So, okay, it may be slightly more complicated. Let's say queen c8. Queen e5 check, he has rook f6. But now I think just bishop d5 and f7 is going to be very hard to defend. Let's say knight d7. Yeah, now we just take rook f7. Let's say king h8 and now probably just queen takes d4, keeping the pin, and white should win. So declining a queen trade was almost impossible. He plays queen f6 and now queen f6, king f6, rook c7. All right, knight e6 attacking the rook. I'll just go through the moves quickly. In this position, rook a4 was played, and of course, as I said, f6 or f5 would make g6 very hard to defend and very hard to move forward. And now white's plan is simple. I'm going to get my king from f3 to e4 and win the d4 pawn. Of course, you have to be patient, and you have to take your time. But of course now, yeah, targeting f7, rook f8 would be absurd. So he plays knight d6, bishop d5, and slowly the king gets into the game. After king g7, king f4, he wants to play king e5, king h6, king e5, and if you play f6, then king e6, and slowly but surely white is making progress. King g7 was played, but now rook a7. And just preparing to double attack the knight, and then when the pawn, king f8 played, rook a8, even smarter, forcing a rook trade because there is no way to defend d4 after the rook trade happens. And rook a7 was a very smart move. Rook takes, bishop takes, the knight has to move, but now bishop c6 attacks the knight, and after knight c3, just don't be rash, don't lose your e2 pawn with check, so bishop f3, he tries to defend again, but now king d5, and it's going to be all over. Of course, once king c5 is played, black should resign. So this, I thought, was a fairly simple example of converting against two weaknesses in your opponent's play, and he knew what to do. He knew that f6 doesn't work, he knew that the queens would have to come off, he knew that he has to get his king up the board and that way win the d4 pawn. A very, very clear-cut example of exploiting the two weaknesses. Okay, those are the 4 games I wanted to look at. I hope you got something from the video. I hope you like the examples. I'm sorry for the examples not being textbook simple positions. I wanted to go over something more complicated. Especially sorry for the Karpov game, that was very complex. And yeah, I hope you liked the video. Please let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.